Welcome everybody to the last open webinar of this year. Really excited to walk you through some key insights on prefab in the construction and installation industry. So prefab in the construction and installation industry. I would like to start with a short introduction of USB. I'll keep this brief, but it's good to understand where the information is coming out from and who we are. Then we'll dive into the topic of prefab, and in the end, I'll share some conclusions with you. Now, starting with USP. And we're a market research agency specializing in the construction, installation, and home improvement market segments. We've been active in the market for over 30 years, supplying our clients with both tailor-made, dedicated market research and off-the-shelf market reports. We operate globally. Last year we did research in 30 countries, and I think our added value is that we really understand the industry. So we're not just able to provide data, but we can provide insights and advice. As said, we basically have two business areas. One is doing dedicated market research. Could be anything from branding, customer satisfaction, market sizing, can be B2B, B2C, qualitative. It will always be tailor-made for you. On the other hand, we have off-the-shelf reports available, market reports covering key target groups in the European market, like architects, contractors, handymen, consumers, and so on. For this presentation, I'll be pulling information mostly from 4 different researchers: the European Architectural Barometer, Contractor Monitor, Mechanical and Electrical Installation Monitors. The target groups, as the name suggests, are architects, contractors, installers. All of these reports are based on telephone interviews in native language, and between 2,000 and 3,500 interviews are conducted on an annual basis. You'll see the countries that are covered in this research. Now, all of these researchers have a report that focuses on the topic of prefabrication. These reports provide a lot more detailed information, including country splits and much, much more than I can show you or share with you in this short time. Our product portfolio is a bit broader than just the 4 I just mentioned. We also have painters, consumers in the home improvement monitor, handymen, and again consumers, but then focused on the garden. And before we start, this is a selection of customers whom we are working for. As you can see, we work throughout the business value chain of construction, installation, and home improvement. Now, with that out of the way, let's focus on the fun part for today, the topic of prefabrication. And before we start to look at the insights and data, I would like to share with you why I think prefabrication is so important, both in the construction and installation markets. First and foremost, it's about efficiency, especially time efficiency. It can reduce the duration of projects, and it can reduce the influence of bad weather situations, for example. Obviously, there's also a cost-saving aspect here. By reducing on-site labor and also economics of scale, if you produce a lot of prefab, you are potentially able to build cheaper. There's also a big opportunity to increase the quality. You have better quality control in the factory environments, and there are less on-site errors and deficits associated with on-site construction. Furthermore, sustainability, there's also a big improvement area there. You can reduce a lot of waste, and you can build with higher levels of sustainability than traditional on-site construction. There's also a safety aspect. Building with prefab can improve safety levels by reduction of on-site hazards and also more production taking place off-site in a controlled environment. And last but not least, scalability. Prefabrication allows for modular construction, and if this really takes off, it can be upscaled quickly depending on whether there's a high need for construction or a lower need for construction. It can be scaled up and down quite quickly. So all important elements why prefabrication is so important. But maybe the biggest one is the necessity of prefab. It's just a pure necessity. And the reason why we have a very high labor shortage, a very, very high labor shortage in the construction and the installation industry. There is already a lack of qualified staff. Now, besides that, the current staff that we do have a very high average age, meaning there will be a huge outflow that can be expected of construction and installation workers in the upcoming 5 to 10 years. And what we also see is that the construction industry, and especially also the installation side, became much more complex. The buildings are becoming more complex, the components are becoming more complex, the construction methods are becoming more complex. And with increased complexity, we see that productivity typically decreases. Now, what are the consequences of this? Well, if you look at the labor productivity levels, it really is lagging behind. In fact, you could even argue that this is European Union, that it actually decreased a bit over time. And if you compare this with the total economy or just the manufacturing side, you see that there were significant gains in labor productivity, but the construction industry seriously lags behind. And focusing a bit further on this labor shortage issue, I think this will be one of the key challenges in the construction industry. And it's not something that is going to happen. It's something that's already happening. If we ask certain stakeholders, do you already experience labor shortages in the execution of your projects? Architects, the highest in the Netherlands, 7 out of 10 say yes. It's the lowest in Italy. Amongst contractors, again, the highest in the Netherlands, almost 70% again. Again, the lowest in Italy. Installers, it's the highest in Germany, with more than 3/4 of German installers stating that they are faced with severe labor shortage issues. And if we take, for example, painters, another target group, it goes up to 90% in Germany. And what I already mentioned, and this is a split for the age distribution, in this case for painters, you clearly see that there's still a huge group of baby boomers, almost 25% on the European level, that will outflow shortly. And there's also a huge amount of Generation X, which can be expected to start outflowing in the upcoming 5 to 10 years. So the labor pool will decrease significantly, and the inflow is not strong enough to combat that. So this is, in my opinion, one of the biggest challenges of the construction industry and one of the reasons why prefabrication is so important. Now let's focus our attention on the actual topic of prefab. So we clearly see that in the last decades, prefabrication in the construction and installation industry has been steadily increasing. And I already mentioned some reasons for this. I just want to elaborate a little bit on this. So labor shortage we covered, but also we see an increased digitalization, an increased usage of BIM. And BIM is a strong enabler for prefab. If a building is built in BIM, it's much easier to apply prefabricated solutions than when it's not designed in BIM. There's also a lot more attention towards sustainability. And as already said, when you build prefab, you can achieve higher levels of sustainability. There's also a huge housing shortage. Now, in the last couple of years, we didn't build enough houses, but there was already a housing shortage, and that only became bigger due to the fact that new build volumes were lower. So there's a huge demand in the market for especially affordable housing. And last but not least, we also see the continuous development of new technologies. For example, prefabrication can now be applied much more in high-rise. It used to be very difficult to apply prefab in projects above 5 floors, but due to new technologies and also legislation that caught up with this trend, it is now possible to build much higher in terms of floors with prefab than ever before. Now, before we deep dive, I want to share with you the background of the target groups that we'll be covering. These icons you'll be seeing back in the presentation. So we have architects, 1 employee upwards, contractors, 5 employees and upwards, and I've combined HVAC and electrical installers in one group, installers. Now, if we look at architects first and we ask what is the share of prefab users in the 8 countries that we cover. It's clear that prefab usage amongst architects is very high in all countries. It's the highest in the Netherlands, with almost 9 out of 10 architects can be categorized as a prefab user. It's the lowest in the UK and France and Italy, with approximately 60%. So that's still quite a high number, but just on the lower end if you compare it with the other countries. So this is the share of architects that use prefab. We've also asked what percentage of your projects contained some form of prefab. And then again, we see that the share is the highest in the Netherlands, 47%. So almost in half of all of the projects of the architects in the Netherlands, some form of prefab was applied. It's also quite high in Belgium, and let's say on a mediate level for Spain, Poland, Germany, and France. It's the lowest in Italy and the UK. So even though in the UK the share of architects that use prefab is relatively high, the percentage of prefab in their projects is quite low. Now, if we look at contractors and we do the same exercise, we first ask, do you use prefab, yes or no? Again, the Netherlands scores the highest, with almost 9 out of 10 contractors, general builders, being categorized as a prefab user. It's quite high in the other countries as well. The only country which scores relatively low is in France, where only 1/4 of all of the contractors are prefab users or are using prefab. If we look at the percentage of projects that contains some form of prefab, we see the numbers dropping. In the Netherlands, it's still the highest. 7 out of 10 projects from contractors contain some form of prefab. It's more or less 50% for Belgium, Germany, Poland, and Italy. Spain is a bit lower, 34%, and it's the lowest in the UK and France, with only 1/4 of all of the projects of contractors containing some form of prefab. Now, if we look at installers, the share of prefab users, it's quite high. It's quite high across the board. Surprisingly, it's the lowest in the Netherlands, as a stark contrast with contractors and architects. And it's really high in Spain, Germany, and Poland. In Poland, almost all installers are prefab users. But if we look at the share of projects that contained some form of prefab, you clearly see that this drops a lot stronger than we saw with contractors and architects. In other words, the majority of installers are prefab users, but the share of projects where some form of prefab is used is slightly lower in terms of conversion rates than we saw with contractors and architects. It's the lowest in the Netherlands. Again, this is quite a stark contrast towards what we saw with contractors and with architects. Unsurprisingly, it's the highest in Poland. So there are strong differences between the target groups when it comes to prefab adoption and the usage in projects, but there's also a difference between the various countries and target groups. One other area where you see significant differences is in terms of company size. If you look at contractors, 5 to 15 employees on a European level, 54% are BIM prefab users. If we look at, let's say, the mid-sized companies, 15 to 40 employees, 71% are prefab users. If you go towards the really large companies, more than 40 employees, it's almost 9 out of 10 contractors that are prefab users. The same applies towards installers. The bigger the company is, the higher the likeliness that they use prefab. Now, if we just forget a little bit about installers for now and just focus on contractors and architects, we see that for the construction side, the Netherlands has the highest share of prefab, both in terms of prefab users and the percentage of prefab in projects. And there are some interesting reasons why the Netherlands scores the highest compared to the other countries. First of all, the Netherlands has a long history of prefabricated houses. We can see after the Second World War that there was a significant housing shortage, and between 1945 and 1975, Approximately, it depends a little bit on your definition, but approximately 200 to 450,000 houses were built prefab. So that's already decades ago. So there's a strong history. The Netherlands is also one of the most digital countries, and BIM usage is also the highest in the Netherlands compared to the other countries. And just like I said before, there is a strong correlation between the usage of BIM and the application of prefab. Furthermore, the Netherlands, as you already saw as well, has a very high labor shortage issue, especially amongst contractors and architects. This, of course, is prompting strongly the usage of prefab. And last but not least, the Netherlands has a very friendly prefab, let's say, residential new build culture. This is a stereotypical, let's say, row house or terrace house in the Netherlands, where one design is copied many, many times to form a neighborhood. And with large numbers of houses built with a repetitive design, of course, prefab becomes very, very useful. And that's why it's applied a lot. Now let's look at the evolution of prefab usage. And then we see something interesting. The orange number represents the latest measurement we had. So if you look at the share of prefab projects, it has been increasing for architects since 2018 to 2019 with 4%. But towards 2021, it remained flat. And in 2023, only a very small growth was visible. And if we look at contractors, there we see between 2022 and 2024, there was in fact a big drop. So for architects, it stabilized. For contractors, there was a big drop in usage. And the key reasons why we see this drop in prefab usage, especially amongst contractors, is first and foremost lower new build levels. Prefab is most often applied in new build. So we see that new build levels were much lower and renovation took over a part of their business. And prefab is just applied far less often in renovation. So the share of projects containing some form of prefab shifted, let's say, more naturally with more renovation versus new build. Furthermore, the last couple of years, we had a lot of uncertainty in the construction industry, in the global economy. And there's one thing we know of times when there is economic uncertainty in the construction industry, it leads to more conservatism and it leads to less willingness to innovate. This also leads to more traditional build versus prefab application. So uncertainty is a major blocker for, let's say, innovation. And last but not least, when we talk about innovation, the prefab market has also lacked some innovation. For example, there's a huge potential for using prefab in renovation, but the solutions for that are still not well developed or let's say not widespread yet. And also industrialized prefab. There is still a low scalability and the numbers of, let's say, really industrial built houses is still quite low. And this lowers the potential in challenging times. Now, I mentioned a couple of times, let's say, new build and how this decreased. This is the development rate, EU 20, for building permits, residential, non-residential. So you can clearly see that after 2022, the permit rate development for residential buildings decreased significantly and is still negative when we looked at the figures at the beginning of this year. For non-residential buildings, we see a decrease happening already in 2022. It continued in 2023. Luckily, we see a slight improvement beginning of this year, but still lower new build levels. So this is basically the reason why amongst architects, the usage of prefab stabilized and amongst contractors, it decreased. But what about their future expectations? Well, if we look at the architects, they do expect a growth of prefab in their projects from 29% in 2023 to 39% in 2030. If we look at the contractors, we see a similar, let's say, growth level. 27 to 35% in 2030. Now, what about installers? Well, we asked the question a little bit differently, but we asked them, what do you think will happen with prefab in the upcoming 3 to 5 years? And installers, the majority of them either report that it will increase significantly, increase slightly, or remain the same. The percentage of installers that mention that they think prefab will decrease, overall is only 3%. So you can imagine the net saldo is more than positive, so growth can be expected for prefab in the installation market. Now I would like to focus a little bit on the different target groups. To begin with, the architects. We asked a lot of questions in our European Architectural Barometer report on prefab. I just want to highlight a couple of findings. Again, in the full reports, you can find much more information split per country, but also much more topics that were covered. But I just want to highlight a couple of key things we see. So we also asked the architects, what type of prefab do you apply most in projects? And what's represented here, the first one on the left-hand side, those are plain prefabricated elements. So walls, ceilings, floors, without any finishing. The second one is panelized systems, so prefabricated panelized systems. The same walls, the same floors, the same ceilings, but with some form of finishing. Could be doors, could be windows, could be, for example, brick strips, could be paint, coatings, electrical installation already being applied, mechanical installation already being applied. So that's panelized systems. And last but not least, modular, so volumetrics or 3D prefab. So what's interesting to see, if we look at the share of projects containing some form of prefab elements, according to the architect, still the majority of prefab being applied is of the simpler kinds. So the walls, ceilings without any finishing. It did decrease from almost 60% in 2021 to 50% in 2023. If we look at the panelized systems, it went up from 32% in 2021 to 37% in 2023. And the most advanced forms of prefab, let's say volumetrics, 3D prefab went up from 8 to 12%. So it's clear that there is a decrease in the usage of more simple prefab and a growth towards more advanced forms of prefab. And if we ask them for their future expectations, what type of prefab do you think will have the highest growth? The highest growth is expected towards the panelized system, so walls, floors, ceilings with some form of finishing applied. Also, they think that, let's say, the plain elements and volumetrics are almost going to grow as strongly. So again, indications of the usage of more advanced forms of prefabs. Now, we also asked the question, what type of projects or buildings contain the most prefab building elements? And I've just listed here the top 5. So it is clearly the residential market where the majority of the prefab is applied according to architects. Multifamily houses, apartments scores the highest, detached houses scores the second highest, and then we get our first non-residential building segment, offices, with 24%. But it's clear that the majority of the prefab is going towards the residential market segments. And we also asked them the question, for which building parts do you expect the usage of prefab solutions to grow the most? Well, not surprisingly, maybe facades, external walls. That's where the majority of the architects foresee the usage of prefab to grow the most. Internal walls, 25%, second place, and then we've got roofs and floors on a combined third place, with approximately 17% mentioning this area. Now, we also asked, and this is a question which needs a little bit elaboration, what structural basic materials do you expect to be dominant for fully finished prefabricated facades, fully finished prefabricated inner walls, and fully finished prefabricated pitch roof? Starting with facades. Interesting. Their expectations is that the dominant material will be wood-based. Concrete takes the second place. In the past, we saw that concrete scored much higher. So there's a clear trend towards more wood-based solutions in prefab for the facade. But this is also the case for inner walls. And of course, maybe unsurprising, for pitch roofs as well. So there's a clear directional change towards the usage of more wood-based solutions. You've also heard me in the beginning mentioning that prefab is being, or has the opportunity now to be applied towards more, let's say, high to mid-rise projects. So we asked the architects, what's the most dominant project size for prefab? On a European level, 75% mentioned low-rise, up to four floors. 18% mentioned mid-rise, and only 3% mentioned high-rise, more than 10 floors. However, there are significant differences per country, as you can see here. For example, in the Netherlands, high-rise application is the highest, 10%, compared to the second highest in Poland, only half of that, 5%. But it's clear that the majority, let's say, of the project size with a building in prefab is low-rise, up to 4 floors. A growth, however, is expected more towards mid-rise and high-rise. Now, if we focus our attention towards the contractors, and we have similar information for the contractors. So let's start again with the share of projects containing different types of prefab elements. So you see again, I use the same definition, simple prefab, so floors, walls, ceilings without finishing, panelized and modular. One thing though, this question was asked slightly different. Here we ask the percentage of these elements in the total projects, not only prefab projects, what we saw with architects. So bear that in mind. But what's clear is that the contractors, they have seen a bigger growth of, let's say, prefabricated plain unfinished elements. Also, the panelized systems increased. Modular remained more or less flat. And their expectations for the future? Well, the highest growth, just like we saw with the architects, will be in the panelized systems, so walls, floors, ceilings with some form of finishing, and they have more or less equal expectations of growth for the simple forms and the most advanced forms, plain elements versus modular. Again, if we look at prefab in different building types, it becomes clear again that residential is the main area, also for the contractors. Detached house, multifamily houses, number 1 and 2. What's interesting, in the top 5, we do see 2 different types of non-residential building areas. The highest is storage warehousing, and on number 5, we have offices. And we also asked the question, what is the dominant size of the prefab projects you've done? And here you can see the development quite nicely. So low-rise applications has been decreasing. Mid-rise has increased quite strongly from 2018 to 2022. Then it stabilized or decreased slightly. But the only area where contractors see an increase is in the projects that are high-rise, more than 10 floors. It's still a very low number, just like we saw with architects, but it's, according to the contractors, the only, let's say, application area where they see a growth instead of a decline. Now, we also asked the contractors the question, what is the most dominant material of prefab, and in this case, panelized system? What is the most dominant material for prefab panelized system? Again, these are floor, wall, ceilings with some form of finishing applied. In contrast to the architects, they mentioned still concrete, but wood or wood-based solutions are on the second place, and this has increased significantly compared to 2 years ago. When we talk about modular or 3D or volumetrics, you already see that the contractors think that wood-based solutions is the most dominant material, and concrete also already takes second place. And if you ask them for their future expectations, which material do you think will grow the most in prefab applications, it's clear that they are in line with the architects with their expectations that wood-based solutions will grow the strongest. Now let's focus on the installers for the final part. Here the questions asked are slightly different. But again, I would refer you to the full reports for all of the details that are in these reports. I just want to highlight some interesting things. So for the first question, I had to split the HVAC installer from the electrical installer because I want to show you the top 5 areas where prefab products are used. And obviously this differs quite strongly if you're an HVAC installer or an electrical installer. For HVAC installers, it's boilers, hot water installation, cooling and AC. It's closely followed by sanitary. On number 5, we have cold water installation. For electrical installers, you can first of all notice that the percentages are higher. And secondly, that let's say the top two is significantly higher than the top four. So electrical distribution boards and panels, wiring, lighting fixtures, number one and two, significantly higher than, for example, protected devices or switchgear, cable trays, and switches and sockets. So there are some core or key differences between the two electrical installation types and HVAC installers. I started to group them together again because in other aspects they are more homogeneous when it comes to their behavior. For example, the top 5 buildings where prefab products were used. Here again you see the strong, let's say, focus on residential. The number 1 till 4 are all, let's say, residential. And the number 5 is the first area where we see non-residential, in this case offices. So the majority of building types where prefab products were used by installers are again residential. Now I also wanted to show you where are they getting their prefab from? Where are they getting their prefabricated products from? Here we see the differences between HVAC installers and electrical installers is limited, but the differences per country are significant. In the UK, Germany and Poland, they mostly purchase prefab solutions from wholesalers. In France, they buy more from specialized prefab suppliers. And in Belgium and the Netherlands, there's more a tendency to prefab yourself. So buy and pre-assemble the separate products yourself. Now, the last question I want to cover with you when it comes to the installers is what are their needs and requirements when it comes to prefab from manufacturers? We asked this question and there is a clear number one answer, that is technical support and consulting. Half of the installers mentioned this, technical support and consulting. Then the numbers 2 to 5 are very close together, but it also has to do with providing product documentation, training, fast, reliable delivery options, and warranty and post-installation support. But the number one, technical support and consulting from the manufacturer when it comes to prefab. Now I would like to move towards the conclusions, or at least what are the key takeaways? What would I like you to remember from this presentation? What are our expectations for the future? So we strongly think that labor shortage will inevitably drive the market towards more prefabrication, and that in the future higher levels of prefab industrialization will improve the benefits of using prefab even more. And as we have seen, as legislation demands are met and technological advances are made, prefab has a huge potential to grow in high-rise construction, but also, for example, in the renovation market, where there's a huge assignment to make the existing building stock more sustainable. And we clearly see that increasing digitalization in the construction and the installation industry will facilitate and accommodate more complex prefabricated designs. Now, there's one important thing I also want to mention. There's also, of course, more attention towards sustainability. Okay, it dropped somewhat, the sense of urgency, but still there is an increased attention towards sustainability in the construction and installation industry now and in the future. And this will also drive the market more towards prefab. Why? Well, prefab construction can lead up to 90% reduction in material waste compared to on-site construction. That's one. Two, prefab houses are typically designed with a higher energy efficiency in mind. The streamlined production process of prefab consumes less energy than traditional construction. And also we see that more eco-friendly materials are used, typically wood-based construction. Both of these things are leading to a lower carbon footprint. And last but not least, prefab construction significantly reduces the overall construction time. Remember where we started. This ensures quicker occupation of buildings. This not only saves cost, but also minimizes the environmental impacts associated with prolonged construction activities and related emissions. Now that's all good news, but what we clearly see is that the construction and installation industry even though prefab is increasing, even though prefab has a high growth potential, is still quite limited because the majority of the prefab that is being applied is basically off-site production in an on-site manner. What do I mean with this? That we do not have a strong industrialized prefab culture yet in Europe. It's mostly taking the construction of the job site and doing it in the factory, but on an on-site manner. And if we want to seriously make gains in productivity levels, prefab needs to become more industrialized. It needs to become more industrialized with, for example, the use of robotics, more modular. Then we can really see an increase in productivity levels. If we just start to build more prefab, but we do it in a on-site manner, the productivity gains are minimal. Or in other words, we really need to transform the way prefab is built, just like Henry Ford did with the automobile industry. Now, what about industrialized construction? Well, I have an example here for the Netherlands. And this shows you, I'm sorry, it's still in Dutch, but this shows you the percentage of new house construction that was done in an industrialized way. So you clearly see from 2018 to, let's say, 2022, there was a modest growth. From 2022 to 2023, there was a stronger growth. But then from 2023 to 2024, the growth remained flat. It remained at the same level. Approximately 21% of the houses in the Netherlands was built in an industrialized way. However, the expectancy is that for next year, this percentage will increase to approximately 30%. So everything you've seen and everything I've shown is also indicative that prefab is not really leading directly to a revolution, but it is an evolution, a slow and gradual evolution, both in application percentages, but also the type of prefab being applied.